everyone for joining. We've got a super exciting session today where we'll talk through how to build multimodal apps with Vertex AI and our friends at LangChain. So before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see an area to ask questions in chat. At the very end, we'll save 15 minutes to answer any of your questions. So please keep asking them. We'll answer all of them at the very end. This session will be recorded. We'll send out the recording to everyone who registered. So no need to ask for the recording. We'll happily share that. And this session is 45 minutes. So we have about 30 minutes of content and 15 minutes for questions. So very excited to get going. Awesome. So agenda for today, Yemi will talk through the basics of RAG, right? What is RAG? Why is it important? What's RAG versus multimodal RAG? We'll discuss the unique opportunities and challenges with multimodal RAG. We'll do a demo of how to build a basic RAG app with Vertex, LangChain, and Astra DB. We'll discuss things to think about before you deploy a multimodal RAG app to production. And then we'll have plenty of time to answer any questions. So to kick it off, Yemi, it'd be great if we could do a quick round of intros.
So my name is Yemi Falakun. I work for Google Cloud, and I'm part of the global partner engineering team. Google, we have a center of excellence that deals primarily with AI and ML. And obviously, throughout this year, folks have been talking about generative AI. So I work with DataStax on how we leverage Google Cloud technology for generative AI solution. Pleased to meet you all.
Yep. I'm Lance. I'm one of the software engineers at LangChain. I've been at LangChain for about 6 months now. I work along the open source library and some work on Langsmith, which is kind of our platform for observability and monitoring. I've done quite a bit of work on multimodal RAG recently, so looking forward to the discussion.
And I'm Alex. I'm on the DataStax team focused on partner integrations. I'm working with folks like Yemi and Lance. So Yemi, I'll let you take it away and talk a little bit about the basics of RAG.
Yeah, I mean, as I kind of mentioned earlier on, I mean, a lot of folks now, it's all about generative AI. We know these models are trained on a large corpus of data. But obviously, what we also know is that, they're only as aware of the information that they were trained on. We know that chances are, even if you are using some of these foundation models, right, they're not really trained on the specific business information that you have within your enterprise. And, they don't necessarily have real-time access to information that you maybe need for some of the use cases that you're trying to solve for. So the key piece is, as part of that workflow of solving that use case, you want to be able to get access to real-time information when you need it, so you can create the relevant context that you can then use for that GenAI task. And really, what you see there is just a schematic of how that works. You need to create embeddings, because right now we're talking about doing semantic search to get those responses that you then use to then drive the GenAI task, whether it's summarization and Q&A, creativity, whatever that GenAI task is. And then obviously with this webinar that we're doing, we have the embeddings that you create, vector search, which DataStax have an Astra DB that you can use to store those embeddings. You can then use that at runtime to search and get the responses, and then obviously send the actual context itself to the LLM to get your final answer. And then down there is a link that you folks can click on that will give you access to a blog. And I think there's probably some notebooks out there as well on how you use things like DataStax, LangChain, and some of the offerings we have at Google Cloud to implement your RAG use case. Next slide, please, Alex. So I think I've covered a little bit of this. So why RAG, and why it's basically, I talked about the hallucinations, right? Just reducing hallucination, leveraging your enterprise data that I talked about. And also, if you're doing, some folks will say, okay, you can do supervised tuning, but there's an expense to that, right? And it's not even dynamic information. There's only so much you can tune at any point in time. Even when you tune to a certain period in time. So that's why it's also cost effective, and it doesn't incur some of those expensive training that you would do if you were supervised tuning a language model. And just to the summary there is just retrieving factual information from DataStax, this is a data store, in this case DataStax, and then using that as part of your prompt to send into the language model to then get that final answer from. So over to you, Alex.
Awesome. So we talked through some of the basics of RAG. I'd love your guys' thoughts on what folks should think about. What are the unique opportunities and challenges of moving from RAG to multimodal RAG? Lance, maybe it'd be great to get your thoughts first.
Yeah. One of the most important things I've found when thinking about multimodal RAG is how are you indexing the images? And there's kind of two major approaches. One is use multimodal embeddings. The other is do something like image captioning, like summarize every image and then just embed those text summaries and retrieve based on text similarity. So again, in most of these applications, you're trying to kind of start with a question, retrieve an image based upon that question, and then answer the question using the image. And that retrieval step can use one of those two approaches. There may be a diagram of those two here in the slides. I'm not sure if that was added, which is fine if it's not. But just in words, those are kind of the two major threads. And there's a bunch of trade-offs between those, which we could talk about. But maybe I'll leave it there to kind of get your reaction.
That makes sense. And I think we'll look at that diagram a little bit later. And I guess, what have you seen with, how does multimodal RAG work with more complex images? Is it more difficult to embed more complex images? How does that work performance-wise?
Yes, I've done some benchmarking on this. So maybe the way I think about it is this: what kinds of content do you want to work with? I've done some demos with multimodal RAG over like slide decks, which are like figures, tables, very dense, very kind of dense images. What I've observed is that multimodal embeddings do not do particularly well there. For example, like I have one demo that's like an investor presentation slide deck that has lots of similar quantitative slides. If you ask a very particular quantitative question that requires retrieval of like one particular slide with a table, multimodal embeddings won't necessarily be able to like easily differentiate between two different tables. But the text captioning is very good at that from what I've seen. Text captioning can give you like, here's a summary of the table, here's what's in it. And then when you do retrieval, you can pretty effectively retrieve the right table given the question. However, multimodal embeddings are very good if you have like lots of just like semantically differentiated objects, photos, things like that. So I think the differences in approach depend a lot on the kinds of images that you want to be able to retrieve. And I have found that for like dense content, tables, graphs, figures, like RAG over slide decks, for example, captioning is actually, from what I've seen, a lot better. Now, of course, I've only used OpenClip multimodal embeddings. I think there are indeed better embedding models. Vertex, I'm actually very curious to play with. And of course, if OpenAI were to release multimodal embedding, I'm sure it could be very, very good. But from what I've seen currently, captioning is really good for things that are kind of very dense images that are not that easily retrieved using kind of a multimodal embedding space.
That makes sense. And Yemi, did you have any thoughts here?
Yeah, probably just double click on some of the challenges. I mean, I think, yes, unique challenges, but I don't know if it's just applicable to multimodal RAG. You still have as Lance talked about, the different images, right? You still have the challenges of making sure when you're creating your indexes, you're creating indexes with the right similar set of images and the right indexes. So when you're doing searches, you still have the challenges. Now that you're dealing with images, which means even larger bytes of data, you still have the challenges of, do I have an historical index versus a real-time index or a more frequent index? How do I partition my indexes? What's my re-indexing strategy? We'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about some of the production aspects of taking a RAG to production. But you still have some of those challenges. But then going back to what Lance said about captioning and doing the actual multimodal embeddings, I think folks know, I think it was on the 13th where we announced Gemini and Gemini Pro Vision, Gemini Pro and Gemini Pro Vision. And Gemini Pro Vision allows you to do, obviously create text from image or text from video, we also have our multimodal embeddings as well that you can use to create those text and image embeddings and store them in a vector database like Astra. So we have that, and I think with the tooling that we have, the folks on the call should be able to take those images, create the multimodal embeddings that they want, create the caption from those embeddings using something like a Gemini provision that allows you to get a text from image, and then use that to drive the semantic search when they send in those prompts to get the responses to what the customers are trying to ask for, using images or even using text as the prompt. Okay.
Absolutely, and we'll give a good demo of that exact workflow in a little bit. So Lance, and one other question for you. So Lance, you touched a little bit on you're seeing users in the wild use multimodal to do Q&A over PDFs. What other kind of enterprise use cases have you guys seen so far? I know it's super early, so.
It is a little bit early. I actually will be honest and say that if I look, for example, like if you go by Twitter activity, I have not seen as much related to multimodal RAG in like the Twitter sphere. Not that that really necessarily matters. What I have heard from talking to companies is slide decks are a really good use case. Companies have lots of slides. They tend to be visual. Documents are an interesting one. There are definitely many cases of documents that contain a mixture of text and images. And I think that is also of interest. I think kind of slide decks and presentation is probably of highest interest because it's so obvious that it's a very kind of good visual kind of QA use case that's enterprise relevant. I think kind of multimodal RAG on like mixed documents of images and text is also of interest. There's a lot of good use cases. We've done a little bit on this with like extraction. So like extracting, and this is a classic task that kind of OCRs obviously done this for a very long time, but like kind of extract some important properties from images. Like that could be like tables, forms. So that's obviously a really big area, but it's like not new at all. And that remains of interest. From what I've seen, I haven't done careful benchmarking on OCR in particular, but I will say when I've seen the multimodal, the closed source, highly performed multimodal models like Gemini, GPT-4V are very strong at kind of extraction from tables. So I think that's another good use case. So I would say like multimodal RAG for like slide decks, definitely interesting use case. For mixed type documents, definitely interesting. Extraction is another really good one. Classic task, has been around for a while. I would say those three are like three that really come to mind. But those are the three I've really seen. But I'm curious, you've seen others as well, or Alex, you as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'll double down on the extraction piece. So think about extracting text from images. For example, you might have folks that maybe just draw out what a form could look like, what a UI could look like, and you can upload that to something like a Gemini provision and say, create the HTML for this image, something like that, right? And then even if the system understands, the language model understands your structure of your HTML within your own platform, it can actually create it to that structure. So it's almost executable. So that's an example of extract text from images. You can do things like Q&A on images. We said you can do things like taking an image and then converting it to JSON, so you can then do follow-on post-processing. Maybe you take an image and you write a story from an image, for example, depending on what platform you're trying to build. So for example, a marketing platform that's probably writing a blog, writing a Twitter feed, something like that, right? They can just put an image on, and then the marketer can say, write me a story based on this image, and they can use that as a starting point to actually create the material that they want to publish, right? Then also, I think we talked about images as well, but there's also video as well. Can you create an ad copy from a video? Can you do Q&A on a video? Those are some of the things that you can do with Gemini Provision. Can you even describe this video content and use that data to do some further post-processing? And a lot of these are sample prompts that we have on Vertex AI that folks can look at to actually get started. And then obviously taking that, they can then build on top of that for their own particular use case. Okay.
Awesome. So Lance, I think this is the diagram you mentioned. You referred to earlier. If you could walk us through this.
Yeah, this is the diagram that I was referencing, and this is just showing at least the two approaches that I've kind of used and seen pretty commonly. Again, we don't need to belabor it, but yeah, multimodal embeddings is one approach. Vertex is a really good option here. The other is this like image captioning idea, where you take every image, you summarize it, you index then those text summaries, which is easy, right? You can use any text embedding you want, link every text like embedded caption to the raw image, retrieve based on the text embeddings that capture the captions, but then return the raw images to the LLM in the end for final synthesis. Those are kind of the two approaches I've seen. And I kind of spoke to the trade-offs, but we can talk about it more later if there's more interest.
Awesome. And the demo we're about to show will walk through kind of this first approach that Lance is showing here. Cool. So I thought that was super interesting. Now we are going to walk you through just a basic demo of how you could build a multimodal RAG app with Vertex and LangChain. But before we get into it, we're just going to quickly walk through the architecture. So there are really two processes here to think about. The first process is the data ingestion process. That's number one at the very top, right? So before you can build a multimodal RAG app, you need to process all your content, right? So to do this, you take all your documents, all your images, all your videos, you feed them into the Vertex AI embedding model, and this will output an embedding, right? An embedding is just a numerical representation of the text, image, all that. And then you're storing this in a database that's designed to store vectors like Astra DB. So once you've done that, you're ready for to build your RAG app, right? And the other kind of core process is the query process, right? So a user can then ask you a question like, what is this image? Show me related images. We convert the user's question to an embedding again. And then we query the vector store to pull kind of the related content and feed this relevant content to the LLM to then kind of get a better response. So I'll walk through exactly how this works with code. If you haven't seen it already, we've shared this link on the right-hand side of chat. So you can play with this notebook as well. So this really is just a really basic app where we show you how to use Gemini, LangChain, and RAG to get Astra together, building a RAG app. So the first couple steps here are just walking you through how to create the necessary credentials, right? You'll need an Astra account. We have links on the right to create an account. Once you've created your Astra account, you'll need to create a vector database and pull some credentials. We show you exactly where to pull them here. Once you've done that, right, you'll also need to create a GCP account and Vertex AI, enable the Vertex AI APIs and pull your project ID. This is super simple. Both these accounts start with free credit. You can get started in minutes. There's some basic installation of the dependencies necessary for the project. Here you can see we're installing RagStack and the Google Cloud AI platform. RagStack includes LangChain. We do some basic loading of credentials as environment variables. We do some basic configuration of the Google Cloud API. And now we get into the interesting part. My coworker Scott sent just kind of this random picture of his espresso machine just to sort of test how Gemini Pro works. This really was just kind of a random image. We didn't know if it was going to work or not, but it worked really well. And we turned it into this webinar content. So here's just kind of a random part to his espresso machine. And we asked Gemini Pro Vision, what is this image, right? You'll notice here, we're using LangChain to interact with Gemini Pro. LangChain makes it super easy to interact with all these models. And the prompt here is, what is this image? Share a link to purchase replacement. And we were super impressed. Gemini Pro Vision was able to identify the exact model of the coffee machine and a link to purchase a replacement. So as kind of Yemi mentioned before, the LLMs are trained right in the past. They don't have access to real-time data. So the only issue here is, Amazon is constantly changing their links. So this link here is out of date, right? So perfect use case for RAG, as kind of Yemi mentioned before. So here's the example of interacting with the Gemini Pro Vision model without RAG. Still like insanely impressive, very cool. I recommend you give it a shot. So now what we've done, now we're sort of getting into the data ingestion process. We took a parts catalog from Breville, right, the maker of the espresso machine. We've done all the scraping for you, so you don't need to do so. We take all these parts, all these URLs, we embed them using the Vertex AI Gemini multimodal embedding model. We feed them into Astra DB, right? Something important to note here is Astra DB supports both vector data and tabular data, right? So I can store my vector embeddings generated from Vertex AI, and I can also store raw information like name and price, the URL. Here we're doing some basic loading. And then we get into the super interesting part. So this is the actual example of multimodal RAG with LangChain and Gemini, right? So this looks very similar to the example above, but this time, in addition to asking what the item is and where to purchase it, a replacement, we feed the the product catalog that we just scraped, right? And because we've injected this relevant information from our Astra DB vector store, we get just a much more precise answer, right? Gemini Provision is able to identify the exact part. It's able to share details. It's able to share the price and information on exactly where to purchase. So really cool stuff. Really, really simple to get started with LangChain and Vertex AI. Definitely give this a shot. We're happy to answer any questions. If you have a more sophisticated use case, we're also happy to help you build that out. And we'll go on to the next item. So we've shown this example, right? You know, let's say you're now sold on using RAG. You're now sold on multimodal RAG. What are the sort of things you should think about before deploying a RAG application to production? Lance, maybe it'd be great if you kick this one off. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I think one very important consideration for production, well, there's maybe a few things. What we've done in a lot of our kind of demos is quite a bit of work on evaluation. So you need some way to actually benchmark performance before you actually ship something, of course. So LangChain has a platform called Langsmith, which is pretty useful for this. And there's a bunch of resources that we can share on this topic. But it does allow you to kind of build evaluation sets pretty easily and then test so say you, in fact, we did this with kind of comparing those two different multimodal RAG approaches. And you can very easily kind of test your different RAG chains against your eval set and kind of build intuition about which approach is better or worse. And I think this is obviously, pretty fundamental, but very important before you ship anything to production. So I think that's consideration one, kind of the ability to run evaluations and kind of build an evaluation set. That's kind of obvious, like table stakes. Consideration two is cost. So I would say that for the captioning approach, one pushback I've heard from people, which is a very valid point, is like, well, you have to produce these image captions for your whole kind of corpus. That could be very expensive. I completely agree with that concern. I've become pretty interested in potentially open source LLMs to do this. So there's there's Lava, Fuyu's out there, Baklava. So there's kind of a series of open source that could be free to use multimodal LLMs that you could do the captioning with, and then still use a more higher powered multimodal LLM like Gemini in your application in production. So I think that's another interesting point. What's the cost of the approach you're taking for indexing? And the captioning approach indeed could be quite a bit more costly because you're generating an image capture summary across your corpus. So I think those are two important considerations: cost of indexing, kind of evaluation. Other considerations in production are like just monitoring. So like, how's your app going? Where is it going haywire? When you're getting bad responses? Langsmith is pretty useful for this. We have lots of tracing functionality, so you can kind of go back. You can look at every generation by your model in production. You can inspect kind of outputs that don't meet your expectation. You can build eval sets from it. And we have a bunch of documentation there as well. So I would say, yeah, like in short, evaluation to start, to gate what you're actually going to ship, thinking about the cost of indexing for your decision, and maybe finding ways to mitigate the cost with open source LLMs for captioning. And then three, kind of monitoring your app in production. Langsmith obviously has kind of features for that as well. I think those are the big three I would highlight. But yeah, curious to get your guys' take.
Yeah, I think I'll go next. Yeah, plus 100 to the three areas that Lance just highlighted. What I'll probably add to that is I'll start with the embeddings management, right? We're creating embeddings. We got to store them somewhere. There's version control. We know, as folks release new embeddings, they get better at creating embeddings, faster creating embeddings. But what does that mean for upgrades? I think right now there's still a challenge around backward compatibility. So how do you maintain version control and make sure that as you're building solutions up and you upgrade into the latest embedding models, you still make sure that the embeddings you created are still working, or do you do a whole migration, which to Lance's point could be a cost challenge because folks have millions of data that they create embeddings out of, and if you do the math on that, that may be cost prohibitive for you to do a migration of embeddings when you uptake a new version of embedding. So version control and upgrade is important. Also multilingual. A lot of the stuff we do in English, but we got to recognize there are people in other parts of the world that want it in their own local language. So what does that mean? Is that multilingual versus English only? Do we use a multilingual embedding? If we know that it caters for that 10 different languages that we look for, and it's maybe good at English, or do we say, okay, we only do it English only, so let's use an English embedding because that's what it's good at. So those are some of the considerations that we need to look into. And I think I talked about indexing and reindexing strategies. As you get new information, you partitioning your indexes such that you're reducing the amount of indexing that you're doing and reducing the cost of creating those indexing. Those are some of the things you need to look for on the embeddings management as you build this application. There's one thing building an application, but you also have to maintain it and care and feed for it going forward for your customers. Then the other piece as well is the non-functional requirements. What do I mean by that? Security. There's a lot of challenges around data residency. I've been able to store data at rest. So being able to call a regional URL, whether it's in North America, Europe, or Asia Pac, I know that the embeddings you created are stored in that location, and they're not going to a different part of the world. Being able to do that. There's also encryption keys. With our service, we always encrypt by default. We have Google managed encryption keys, but customers might want their own encryption keys. For example, in regulated industries like finance, healthcare, where they want to have their own encryption keys. So we support that with custom managed encryption keys. There's also the networking aspect of it. I don't want this thing to be public facing. I'm still building, even as a GenAI application, I'm still building an application within my enterprise. So I've got to be able to apply things like VPC controls and service controls to make sure there is no data going out, to make sure there is no unauthorized access, to make sure I'm protecting and building a perimeter around my GenAI resources and protecting them accordingly. And then access transparency. Who has access to my system? What kind of audit logs am I collecting? If someone is fixing, for example, if Google Cloud is supporting responding to a support ticket, what data are they looking at to resolve that issue for me? Access transparency is also a key one there as well. And then when you look at development to production, how do you get to, you've done a lot of development, Lance mentioned a lot of tools that you can use as part of your development lifecycle to make sure what you're building is fit for purpose, and you can obviously continually monitor and manage it as you go forward. But how do you migrate from your POC, your development to production? What is that test to production system? That's where some of the tooling that Lance mentioned around LangSmith, Astra DB, having been able to create your development environment, being able to load your data, migrate your environment as you go to production, having different environments for your Vertex AI, and being able to promote your code as well. That's where you need to think about what does your SDLC lifecycle look like when you're building these GenAI apps. And then one other final thing I mentioned is things around service terms. We talked about images, we talked about embeddings. This language models are trained on data. The provider that you're using, how are you being indemnified on the output that you're generating from these language models? Do they provide the right level of indemnity so that you can make sure that if you're using, whether you're using text embeddings or multimodal, whether you're doing Q&A to get those captions, whether you're actually creating images as well, are you indemnified? And those are some of the stuff that Google Cloud we do with indemnification service terms. So I think I'll leave it at that. Hopefully that helped some of the folks looking to deploy right into production. Okay.
That's super helpful. And I'll just add, so we at DataStax run a production chatbot that uses Gemini in production, and really agree with lots of the points brought up. What's been really important for us is the testing aspect. that Lance talked about, right? Like making sure we get the right responses from the LLMs for commonly asked questions. And also, you talked a little bit about the software development lifecycle, right? It's been super important to really make sure we're using kind of the standard software development lifecycle with our prompts, right? So we store all the versions of our prompts in version control, right? So we can easily kind of measure and keep track of kind of what's changed as we improve our bot. So awesome, guys. That was really great. I think now we'll get into questions. Okay, cool. So first question. In the demo, I noticed you used Gemini Pro Vision. Is there any reason you couldn't use just Gemini Pro? So that's probably a good question for you. I guess what is the difference between the Gemini model?
Yeah, so Gemini Pro is more of a text foundation model. I think what you saw in the demo was Alex uploaded an image of a coffee filter, I think, and then asked questions of it, and then was doing multimodal. So that's why he's using Gemini Pro Vision, because that's what Gemini Pro Vision does. It allows you to do things like text from image and text from video. That's the reason why he's doing that. Okay.
Got it. And you talked a little bit about support for multiple languages. Does Gemini support multi-language embeddings? I can't remember.
Well, the multi-language embeddings comes from you using the API from, and we have a multimodal embeddings API. We also have an English-only API, and I think the multimodal embedding supports foreign languages. And there's a page online. There's at least maybe about 10 or so languages. I'll have to look at the page, but there's multiple languages that we support with the multimodal embeddings. Yeah.
Got it. Very cool. What is the difference between LangChain and LangSmith? Lance, that's probably a good question for you.
Yeah. So LangChain is an open source library or package that has support for JS as well as Python. That's kind of like an application development framework for LLMs, and it integrates with like 700 different components, Astra DB being one, different embedding models, Vertex, for example. I think that PR is in progress right now. So LangChain is kind of like an open source app development framework that you can use to stitch things together to build different LLM applications. LangSmith is kind of an observability tool that does tie in with LangChain, but does not require LangChain. And LangSmith basically allows for monitoring, evaluation. So in particular, when you have an application, you can use it to monitor all the traces. So like every time the LLM is run, what goes in, what goes out, what's called. If you have like a complex chain, every step in the chain, every input output from each step. So it's a very nice tool for what we call kind of monitoring and observability. It has a few other things. It supports evaluations, as mentioned. It supports kind of building data sets. But that's kind of LangSmith. So it pairs very well with LangChain, but you actually don't need to use LangChain in order to use LangSmith.
Makes sense. There was another question on Gemini. I'm curious when there will be a way to load PDFs directly into Gemini without the need to split documents into pages and load these pages as images.
Yeah, so that may come when you have supervised tuning of Gemini Pro Vision. Because right now, if you tune in a model, right, you typically have to create a JSON-L format, which means chunking the data and all that stuff. But I think the question is probably looking at when you will be able to supervise tune a Gemini Pro Vision, for example. Yeah, and so that when that comes, that will be probably when folks will be able to do something like that. Yeah.
Got it. And Lance, I guess question for you. So we heavily use the LangChain recursive text splitter for like text chunking. Is there any sort of text splitting functionality in LangChain for images? Or is that something you guys have thought about?
Interesting. What do you mean by that? How do you think about like split? What do you mean by splitting images?
I guess this kind of question here, does LangChain have a way to break a PDF into multiple pages?
Okay, so good point. So yeah, in a lot of my demo apps, we have not done an integration, But there are a number of different packages out there that take a PDF and split it into a bunch of images. I can look up what I use. I think it's let me check my code here really right now. We use check the ingest script here. Maybe go to the next question. I will find it.
Got it. Sounds good. What is the process to migrate from Google models like Text Bison to Gemini? I can take that one actually. So we actually just did this at DataStax for one of our production chatbots. With tools like LangChain, it's very, very simple to migrate models. It was as simple as kind of just switching the model name, and like we were up and running very, very quickly.
I don't know if there's a way to post links on the but there is an actual page that's tied to the migrate from Palm API to Gemini API on Vertex AI. So if you go online and perhaps just put that search in, Google it, no pun intended, you should get under that page that gives you instructions, and I think there's probably even code, side-by-side code that shows you what changes are between Palm and Gemini. So yeah, that's up there on the public docs.
Yeah. One thought on the prior question, look at PDF IUM. That's one. If you just Google, there's a bunch of them, but basically going from a PDF to a bunch of images, there's a bunch of good stuff out there. We haven't actually integrated with LangChain. It seems like kind of just like an unnecessary wrapper around like a very simple to use component. Although, maybe it is worth just pulling it in. So there's some consistency around how you call it. Yeah, that's the one I use.
Awesome. Cool. Well, that was all of the questions. Thank you, everyone. Oh, actually, one more just came in. Sorry. Are there any plans on Gemini timeline for assistance like OpenAI has? With Astra DB, it would be interesting.
For assistance? I
think the question is, are there any plans for Gemini to build some sort of kind of easy way to build assistance? Like OpenAI recently released this assistance API, which is sort of like a very easy to configure kind of chatbot type thing. I think the closest thing to what Google is doing is like the Vertex AI search.
So I get it. So we have something called Vertex AI conversation AI, which if some of the folks are familiar, they used to read that, and there still is a solution called Dialogflow. So the evolution of that, adding GenAI to that, is now called conversational AI. So that's a solution for building kind of an enterprise grade chatbots. If you wanted a managed solution that's already got a lot of the bells and whistles, and you just need to customize it, maybe do some extensions for a particular use case, then you can use that conversational AI solution. And I think there are probably notebooks out there that show you how to build applications around that. But also recognize that the language models themselves also support the chat interface. So you can use something like, and I think you use that in your code, right? You can use something like the LangChain chat APIs to make a call to the language model, and then kind of have that multi-tone conversation going around your use case. Because most likely, if you're building chat, you're probably going to embed into some kind of UI within your enterprise. So you've got those options. Either you kind of white label a conversational AI such solution if you're looking for a managed solution, but if you think you want to roll your own, then you can use something like LangChain. You can use our API calls for a language model and kind of use our chat foundation models, and then kind of roll your own multi-tone conversation around the chat application. Yeah.
Awesome. We actually just got a lot more questions also. This one is for you, Lance. This will be a fun question. It's a performance question. Do you find LangChain to be slower for executing similar steps compared to custom code?
I haven't actually tested latency, LangChain versus just like hitting raw, for example, OpenAI API. So I can't honestly answer that. If someone has links to the documentation that's like looked into that, I'd be curious. It's not obvious to me that LangChain would add significant latency. I think the bigger question is kind of like the latency typically more comes from, for example, hitting vector DBs, what vector DB integration you're using. That's kind of where I've seen, or most of the latency comes from like the API itself. So it's not clear that kind of having LangChain in the middle really adds significant latency to a chain. It's really kind of the retrieval step as well as the the language model API itself. But if there's some interesting, like, feel free to put in the chat if there's interesting like references you've seen or any like posts on that. I'd be curious.
Totally. Sorry, excuse me. And the last question is, what is the best way to learn fundamental concepts of RAG pattern and components in RAG pattern, like vector DBs, embeddings, and things like this for a regular software developer? Yeah, so we can pull together some good links and also follow up with this as well. Google has a lot of content on this. LangChain has a lot of good content on this. We also have created a bunch of content. It's way easier than you think to start building RAG apps with some of the awesome technology available today. Okay, cool. Well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate
Alex, I think there was a question on the Q&A. A gentleman by the name of Kartik, first name Kartik, asked the question, will you be covering high-level architecture for enterprise GenAI? I mean, while we don't have a diagram showing that, right, I think some of the content that we've covered there, talking about the unique challenges, talking about, some of the things you need to look at when you're deploying a RAG application into production. Hopefully that gave you some of the content that you can use to build an high-level architecture for enterprise GenAI. So, hopefully we were able to cover some of the content for that while we didn't have a diagram to show you on a high-level architecture. Okay, over to you, Alex.
Oh, we just got another question. I should stop saying this is our last question. Do you have recommendations for capturing embeddings from existing web-based assets in an automated way? I think both Google and LangChain have good solutions for this. Yemin, do you maybe want to start?
Yeah, that's a great question, because that's the use case I mentioned about extracting text from images. Exactly that. You can use the Gemini provision, there are APIs that you can call. You can actually start by just taking one of those UI and upload them and just say extract the fields from this image or create me an HTML from this image, and you can see the response that comes out. And then once you have that, and once you figure out what prompts you need to get the right level of detail you're looking for, then you can then probably look at some of the notebooks we have and actually use that to actually build out to automate that process. So most likely you have a bucket of images, and then you just iterate through that and get the caption and then store it somewhere. So yes, you can do that with Gemini for Vision for sure. And also you can do that with, I know this has been a lot about Gemini, but it's also Imagine 2, which you can also do for visual Q&A as well, and captioning. It actually has a captioning functionality that you can also use. You can do that to the UI just to test it, but also you can also use the APIs through a notebook in Python or whatever language of choice you have to automate the process as well.
Vince, did you also have some thoughts? I know LangChain does a really nice job of some of that with like the document loaders that integrate with like scraping tools.
Yeah, there's definitely a large number of document loaders. I can share kind of our integrations hub. I'll share that right now. And there are a good number of different document loaders for web content for sure. I just shared that. Oh, we got another. I see. We're capturing embeddings from existing web-based assets in an automated way. Yeah. I'll maybe highlight one or two. Structured URL loader is pretty good. I like that one. I'll share that. What else? Yep, that's good for now, I think.
Awesome. Well, looks like we're out of time. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We'll definitely share all these resources we mentioned afterwards. And if you have any questions, send them our way. We'll continue to answer those via email. Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.